Okay, good afternoon. I am Anto Budiarjo. This is Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday afternoon, unless you're in Indonesia, in which case you get somebody else to do it. But I'm back. We gather here weekly to discuss the future of smart buildings, and I've been doing so for at least a couple of years now. Just in case you wonder who we are, the panelists are listed on mondaylive.org. And just to point out that views expressed here are personal, not of any company or organization. Please do post questions and comments on the Zoom chat. We really would very much like to make this as interactive as possible. And also this slide deck is available on mondaylive.org, right there on the homepage, in case you want any of the material that we post on it. So this being April, we've decided that we want to focus this month's conversations on the cloud, and specifically how the cloud relates to buildings, the building systems, obviously. So looking forward to good conversations about that. So our agenda for today, our normal chit chat and news and trends, and we'll talk about the cloud. And specifically today, we want to have a sort of an open discussion with panelists, and hopefully to get you involved on chat to sort of figure out what really what we think what the cloud is to us, and what the role of the cloud is with regards to building systems. So quite an open conversation this week to get us going on this topic. But before we get into that, hand it over to Ken. What's going on over in your world, Ken?
Well, thank you, Anto. Of course, we've just reinvented ourselves in the cloud, and are really excited. So I think if you want to get your write your words in the cloud, Automated Buildings is the place to do it, either as a sponsor or as an editor, or just send me some information that you'd like to get posted. So thanks for the lead in on that. This slide actually is an interesting slide to me, because it summarizes a bunch of stuff that's kind of gone on in my life for the last 50 years. It's kind of gelling, so very interesting. Our first post is from Audrey, our newest and youngest woman contributing editor, and she writes an article in trying to encourage others into the industry. That has been a lifelong goal of mine, is to try and grow the industry younger. And we're starting to see some turnaround on that. We're starting to see some young people taking part, not only in the industry, but in the verbalization of the industry, which is extremely pleasing to me. Before Automated Buildings, we created a company called Enviromation, and we had this great idea that if we combine the words environment and automation into Enviromation, the world would be the path to our door. It crashed and burned. We may have been a little too early. That was like 27 years ago or something like that. But now we all are enviromationists, and that's kind of a new word I think we can play with. The actual company that owns Automated Buildings is called ESI, Enviromation Services Incorporated. Just a little information there. The next sort of victory, I guess, is Scott, who's the CEO of a company, the original company I started in 1975, SES. They basically carried that company on, and where we built that consulting company with energy conservation and automation, their claim to fame has been more saving carbon and the electrification. And they've been at that for now almost 20 years. And he basically has an article in the B2E coalition in Vancouver, and some of the work they're doing there, some pretty interesting stuff that's worth a read. One of our advertisers is sort of featuring sustainability as one of their big hooks, which I think is good. I think that's an indication of where the industry's heads at in this, in how important sustainability is becoming, and electrification and decarbonization. And in addition to that, our local chapter of ASHRAE is having their trade show, and they've asked us to speak, and we have put together a little program called How to Speed Decarbonization. And Brad White is leading that up. Really pleased to see that happen. I think we have a unique opportunity here in BC, British Columbia, Canada. We pretty much all of our power is just water over the dam. And so we actually do have green power. So moving to electricity is something we can do right now and be carbon free. So they kind of go hand in hand. So I think we have an opportunity to kind of lead the world, because we can start converting our buildings and get some experience in what that's looking at.
Great.
Okay. So I'll give the floor back to you, but that's what's happening at Automated Buildings.
Thank you, Ken. Mark.
So today I actually have three. I have this things that kind of go into my I did not know that, and I should know that. So the first one is a continuation about companies, especially in the tech sector, continuing to shed office space. And this is just another example about Seagate out in San Francisco area doing that. And I guess it starts to question, you know, for how long is this going to continue? How much space will we see transformed into unoccupied? Who's going to replace this space? If no one does, how does a landlord start to pay their debt on the building? And how much will that building be worth? The same, less? We know it's not going to be more than it was 3 years ago. So just some questions to start thinking about that. And what really got me looking at this is that I seem to see something like this each and every day now. It's repetitive. It wasn't just a one-off. So that, again, has some concerns or calling out attention. The next one is I really encourage everyone in here to read this article. The real reason Amazon just called everyone back to the office. You won't believe how scary it is. And it's not so much Amazon for the benefit of Amazon, but it's the bigger picture in how we could conceivably move from a centralized city type, and that's the larger cities, New York, San Francisco, LA, whatever, to a move to a decentralized environment, whereby this is going to lead to home prices, residential homes, dropping substantially. And there's a figure in here, and again, I encourage everybody to look at it, that they're equating over 40 trillion, that's with a T, drop in residential homes globally as a result of this. Kind of, when you think about it, we've been talking about the office and everything else, but then now we're starting to see this extension to other areas in which the hybrid office is starting to take place. So I just read it. And the last one,
Mark, before you get up, what's the logic behind the drop in home values? I don't understand.
Is that people are moving more to the suburbs,
Right.
the cities, and those homes or that residential is starting to decline, and they can't fill them. It's that part. It's that move.
So you're
from-
talking about the homes in cities, not the homes in the suburbs.
Correct.
Okay, that
Sorry.
makes sense.
Yeah.
All right.
Mark, why does Amazon care? I mean, I understand the problem, but why
Yeah.
does Amazon care? You know, they're saying that's the
Right.
reason they're calling people back, but what's it to Amazon?
Because they feel like take what their contribution to the city of Seattle is and to other cities where there's a huge concentration of their employees there.
Right.
They don't want the city to then, start to fall apart after they've made a huge investment into those particular areas. So, but again, everybody's going to have a different perspective on it. Read the article, but this is the first time I've seen an article that really equates those together.
Though, as Audrey has just posted on chat, reducing home prices isn't really a bad thing for us consumers, right?
For those who want to buy, Audrey, I want to sell. So if you're interested, call me. Okay, we can make a deal. Okay, but anyway, so the next one is just to call everybody's attention to today, 50 years ago, the first cell phone call or mobile phone brick call was made from Manhattan. Do you guys believe it's been 50 years?
Wow.
Look how much the industry has changed. Look how much our lives depend on a little thing that we hold in our hand over and over. But 50 years, guys, it's amazing. It just blew me away. It's been 50 years.
Yeah.
So that's what I got.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I had a couple of things. They're both on the same theme. As I landed in Indonesia last 2 weeks ago, this report on the left came out, the IPCC report about climate change. And it's basically a 5-alarm fire, if you want to think about it that way, in terms of the seriousness of it, and giving us basically a decade for action to move things forward. So I think that's very relevant. And obviously buildings is a key part of the whole sort of potential of reducing carbon emissions. So that's highly relevant to us. And the second article, which is on the same theme, very interesting article about how some movements of ice in the Antarctic is changing through models, is changing the way the oceans are circulating around the globe, that can have major impact to climate in the coming centuries, effectively. So, two interesting articles that hopefully we can figure out how we can help mitigate.
So Anto, just being the voice for the doubting, if you will, another point of view. So the IPCC reports, if you go back 15 years ago, they there's not a lot of credibility because all their forecasts have proven not true, particularly in the short term. So you have to read these reports very carefully because they were forecasting by now that a number of places would be underwater, and of course they're not. The second thing about the Antarctic is they're trying to decide whether what's going on with the ice is a result of CO2 or very possibly with regard to volcanic action going on well below the surface. And so again, just to think that to conclude that the reason that's happening is because of CO2 is not necessarily a good conclusion to reach. So I'm the contrary voice in all this, and I don't mind being that. But I think it's worth understanding that there are multiple perspectives on both of these issues.
Of course. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So there's a C4SB update, but Rick is not here. He mentioned that Monica may be here, but I don't see her. So you can just see it there. I know, talking to Rick, that the young professionals is a new group within C4SB that is being formed, or it is forming, and there's a kickoff meeting tomorrow. So again, if any of you want to get involved in that, there's a couple of emails there, either to Monica or to Rick. There's also some activity in Kansas City that C4SB is participating in that is very interesting. Maybe if Monica joins later, we can ask her to chime in.
Do you think the second line there should not say no need to have 30 years? In fact, if you've got it, you're not allowed.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Good point. So this is just a link board for sort of interesting information and events. I did add the Vancouver Island ASHRAE event there, so that's good. Any other thoughts or news anybody want to bring up before we move on?
I have historically been the reporter for some of the QSR fast food restaurant related news. Big announcement today that McDonald's is planning a layoff this week. Interestingly, it's all corporate stuff because their sales are up, their average ticket size is up, everything about their business from that standpoint is doing well, but they're trying to get out in front of economic changes that are coming and realigning to be more efficient. So a lot of these layoffs seem like they're going to be in, well, they're all corporate, not restaurant, in the finance tech kind of arenas. And one of the things they're looking at doing is closing some of their corporate offices. So another reduction in commercial real estate usage. So
I think we've been talking about that, you know, the corporate sort of headquarters and the commercial offices for some time. I think it's kind of inevitable. I think, you know, with the things that Mark brought up, the, you know, the hybrid working, it's just one of those things coming in. It's just, you know, how big that's going to be. You know, the challenge is, I suppose, that any new construction is probably still being financed because the pension funds agreed to it a few years ago and stuff. And once that runs out of momentum, and there's just going to be a lot of office space, and people are just not going to renew their leases for the bigger amount of space. They're getting more confident now, knowing what hybrid looking like, and will probably then consider what they're going to do with that, how much space they actually need.
And I
It
think you're
was-
right, Roger, to add on, I think we, as far as on Monday Live, we have been talking about it for now, but reality now has set in.
Yep.
Before it was talk, but now we're seeing actual reduction of office space, commercial office space.
it's what's interesting to me about this announcement too, is they're doing this in a time where most of their business indicators are positive and going forth. And I mean, the fast food industry, and McDonald's in particular, always does better during difficult economic times when the economy in general is not as strong, or there's inflationary periods or anything negative. McDonald's does better, right? Their sales go up and so forth. So as people look for lower cost alternatives to going out to eat. So you know, historically they've been reactive. In the case of economy turns down, then they have to react. This one is a little bit different because I think it is tied somewhat to the hybrid workspace, along with maybe some anticipation of what's going to happen in the economy, right? And one would say that them being proactive says they believe the economy is going to get better and stronger in the not too distant future, which means that their sales might suffer somewhat. So it's kind of an interesting multifaceted reasoning here from what I can read so far. I mean, it's all kind of early news yet. More time will tell, but the fact that it turned into this commercial space part of it was kind of interesting to me.
And I don't know what the unemployment figures are now in the US, but certainly here there's still a lot of job openings, even though there's been layoffs. And I saw a chart, and I probably should have captured it somewhere, where it actually showed you know, that lots of jobs that have disappeared, like secretaries and bookkeepers and stuff like that, but you know, they kind of raised to another level and got, you know, different sort of roles as we've kind of evolved. And I wonder whether people are, you know, as they're getting laid off and they're just taking these other options, and we're going through that whole thing we talked about before with the change from the, you know, log books and slide rules and calculators which weren't allowed and all those sort of things, which all it's doing is allowing a faster progression, but people are changing roles and functions. And if there's a lot of layoffs, you know, is that really affecting the unemployment numbers at the moment, or are they just doing other work?
Shuffling.
Yeah,
Let's,
John,
should
you're
we?
mute, Mark.
I know we got to move on. I would just add, what I am seeing is a new focus by these every organization looking at revenue per employee as a measurement now, and that they're equating X dollars in revenue, obviously per employee, and they're trying to get to that model. So I think that's part of what you're to add to what you're saying, Roger, is I think that, or sorry, Tracy, about some of the layoffs being done now versus later, in addition to preparing for future times.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let us move on then to the cloud computing and buildings. So to kick this month off, I thought we'd sort of frame the discussion a little bit in terms of thinking about cloud computing. And cloud computing really, basically at the end of the day, is computing. And this model, I was actually reminded of this model in one of the C4SB committees, the Open Appliance Committee. Al Putnam brought up this sort of concept, which is basically that computing has always had this sort of concept of IPOS. Every computing system has an input, it has processing, it has output, and it has storage. Right. Everything since the 60s and the 70s, the laptop that we use has all of these components. Obviously, over time, the number of input mechanisms, from keyboard to mice to cameras and microphone and everything else, has evolved, and the output has evolved, processing has evolved with graphic processors and others, and storage has obviously evolved significantly, but the basics are still the same. We go through this whole process. And it sort of occurred to me that if we look at the computing systems that this industry deals with day in and day out, which typically looks something like this. This is just a representation. It happens to be a Metasys one, but you can plonk any other sort of variation, is the same. This also has the IPOS concepts in it. Obviously, each box is a computing device, so it has input, output, and processing and storage. But if you take the whole system as a whole, there are elements, there are components that are doing the inputs, the components that are receiving outputs, and there is storage and there's processing, and they're in various locations given the specific architecture and the specific products of that particular brand, right? So we know this. So in other words, the IPOS sort of concept is not just in the computer, it's actually in the network computers that we're very familiar with. So the question is, what happens to this when we start to go into the cloud? And the first point that I think I'd like to make, I'd like to have a bit of a discussion about this, is that really the only cloud that makes sense for us to think about, certainly the future of cloud, is multi-cloud computing, where your the cloud today is really you're using Azure or using AWS or Google, and that's really just a specific service that you're using without much flexibility, and it's very, very difficult to go across those platforms. And the cloud architecture of the future is really multi-cloud, where you can have different applications in different public cloud services, whether it's Azure, AWS, or anything else. And then you also have private cloud environments or public database data centers that become part of the cloud, and also considering things that are on-prem, specifically in buildings for us, as being part of this big cloud, right? So it becomes a sort of a multi-cloud environment. And again, each of the individual computers obviously have their own IPOS, but how does IPOS play out in this big multi-cloud environment? Well, it plays out quite nicely because interestingly, what it enables us to do is to have the different components in different places, right? So a typical scenario could be that the input and the output are on-prem. The input could be a sensor, the output could be an actuator or something, and the processor could be in some public cloud, and the data store could be in some private cloud, right? And that's one of the interesting things about multi-cloud is with the cloud computing is you can actually put all of these IPOS elements in different parts of the cloud and let the network be the things that actually connect them all together. And it doesn't have to be like this; it can be actually like this, where the input could actually be in some cloud. If you think about this as sort of a scenario of this could be a weather service that's in the public cloud providing an input that then has to be processed by some process computing on the private cloud, and the public cloud may have the storage of data as necessary, and the resulting of all of that is some output that will actually, I don't know, turn a fan on or off, or whatever it is, right? So really what's interesting about cloud is that you can start to split up these sort of IPOS components and put them almost anywhere that they are best suited to run, to do whatever it is that they need to do. And this is just another scenario that can actually have none of the elements on-prem at all. Right, so it could be the input of somebody requesting a report, and the process is running there, goes to get all the data from public and produces some output that goes on a website, for example. So it doesn't actually touch the on-prem at all, right? So with the cloud, you get this sort of enormous flexibility of where things are, and it's fundamentally the same computing paradigm as the original sort of single board computer. Right. So the question then is that how is this all managed? How do you actually make all of this work? And it's interesting to look at how things have evolved into these sort of these sort of three paradigms that I've been presenting, thinking about what the communications are between the elements and how the communications is coordinated, because that's obviously all of these input and output and processing and storage need to communicate with each other, right? So how is that done, and how do you coordinate all of that, orchestrate all of that? So if you go back to the leftmost, the simple computer, if you think about a laptop or any other sort of computer device, you obviously have things like the motherboard. The motherboard actually does the communications between a lot of these things. And then we have buses that you can plug in board, you can plug in extension cards back in the old days. And then we have USB and HDMI today is obviously the way you do outputs and other things, right? So there's always sort of communication technology that connects all of these components together. So then the question is, how does that all get coordinated, right? How is it when I press an A button on the input, an A comes out on my display, right? So something has to deal with all of that, and the answer to that in a single in a computer is the BIOS and the OS. The BIOS is the basic input-output system, and the OS is the operating system like MS-DOS, Linux, etc. Right? So that's how it works, right? So then the question is, how does this work on the center, on the control system? Well, the communications is typically between this is between the elements, between the devices, typically RS485, BACnet, obviously other protocols, and increasing the IP, right? So that's how the I and the P and the O and the S's communicate with each other. And the next question is, how does it all get coordinated? Because something has to do that. Some entity has to coordinate it, and this is really where control systems come in. Things like Metasys, Niagara, and other control systems are the entities that actually organizes what happens when an input occurs, and where it sends everything else. And obviously, in the control system, it's very structured. As we all know, it's very structured and typically in a hierarchical fashion. So the question is, what does the IPOS look like in the cloud, in the multi-cloud? The communications between them, I think we all know it's IP. As APIs will actually provide ways of the different systems to talk to each other. PubSub mechanisms such as MQTT and others do that. There's a lot more events and messaging in a cloud environment. And then the question is, how do you do the coordination? And I think this is the most interesting part of this, is that this is really a lot of the new stuff that's happening here. And it's really orchestration, something like Kubernetes, which is obviously happens in the data center itself, starts this whole process. It orchestrates the components of a data center. And then you have CNCF, which is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is part of the Linux Foundation that actually is formalizing a lot of standards in this area. And MCNS and IBM are both terms that Gartner is throwing around right now in terms of multi-cloud ways of actually them working together. CNSCP is something that we've talked about on Monday Live and other platforms, something that we're working on. So there has to be some orchestration or collection of orchestration technologies or mechanism for all of this to work in the cloud. So now, obviously, this sort of orchestration view is a futuristic view. I don't think it's in long term, but it's definitely not in play today, but it's evolving. But I think the conversation about cloud computing for buildings really needs to be sort of held with this sort of anticipation that there's this or some variation of this is really how cloud computing is likely to play out. So I kind of wanted to start here. That's the last slide that I have, and maybe opening up to a discussion with the group and see what else is people have thoughts in the audience. Any thoughts immediately from the group here?
Yeah. So so my see, I was getting ready to call you Arno because I got after 2 weeks of being gone. so I think my first comment is going from the middle to the right. Okay, the progression of our systems into the cloud has been is happening with increasing frequency. Right. And while all that's happening, the complexity of cloud computing continues to evolve, as you're illustrating in your diagram here. So you've got a fundamental as a developer of any kind of technology today, software engineers, when they're building applications, you have to ask yourself, where do they want to put them? And how are they getting trained? And the answer is cloud, right?
How are they getting trained? What do you mean trained?
Yeah, as software engineers, they're being trained on developing applications within a cloud environment, and that's their familiarity and their expertise is growing in that area. So the traditional idea of building something on the far left, where you build an application for a specific server, as an example, and deploy it as a packaged piece of software, is becoming increasingly less popular as an option, right? You mentioned at one point, however, that clouds can be on-prem, right? Mm-hmm. And that's true because you can build a server environment that's essentially a private server with a cloud architecture within it. And so now you have the ability to essentially do, again, what's going on the far left, but in a cloud environment. But fundamentally, I think we could all agree that the transition to cloud computing is unescapable. Okay, it's achieved escape velocity. Okay, from a developer's perspective, and so the question is, where are we as an industry in adopting and knowing how to work in cloud effectively? And I think we're at the begin, in many respects, at the beginning of this journey. We have a lot to learn, and I think we can spend a lot of good time over the next over the course of this month talking about that.
You know, Steve, is interesting that, I mean, I just dropped offline, and I think that's an interesting perspective from where we come from BAS. You know, in building automation systems, what happened, we went from a centralized system because people said the communications weren't reliable enough to a distributed solution.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, as we've now gained more confidence, we're happier on-prem to have it a little bit more centralized with things like Niagara or stuff. But, you know, are people still, at the moment, confident enough to actually do things real time with the cloud without perhaps dropping out every now and again? I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think people have quite that confidence yet that you know, you're not gonna be connected 100% of the time. And I think that's a challenge for the whole thing to move across, because it's that split between what's real time and what is, you know, accessing the data and taking actions.
But if I can jump in, Roger, I mean, it's almost like you didn't quite say it, but it's almost like that perspective is building, and there's a cloud up there that you connect to the cloud, and that may not be reliable, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Right. So that's almost that perspective. And I think that's absolutely the wrong perspective to think about the cloud. And because this is the point of this drawing here is that
Yeah. No, I get that.
cloud is really the whole thing.
The whole thing. Yeah.
The whole thing. And with it, and if you architect all of the systems in a way that is cloud native, which is what the whole cloud native sort of movement, it actually doesn't matter where
the data is. No, I get that.
Where the
Or where you're
pieces
picking
are,
up any bits of it. Yeah.
and it can actually move dynamically. So if you're connected to the cloud, a bit of processing could actually happen in the cloud, and when it's disconnected, that same processing could also happen locally, and it can actually move dynamically. And so a lot of the sort of restrictions, or sort of the limitations, if you think about the cloud as being a remote thing, almost goes away if you think about it in this way.
Yeah, I kind of get that. And so, but at some point, there's a real thing that we want to have an effect on, and that real thing is kind of stationary. That's the one thing that doesn't move, whether it's a piece of equipment or it's something that we want to take an action on. And so there's still a goal of where that sits. And I think that's the bit that I'm challenged with. I can get, you know, we can move the stuff around of where the data is, where the actions are taken, where the information is, but ultimately we're still going to be, you know, which is where you were in building automation. There was a killer, or there was a piece of plant you wanted to turn on, and people were concerned about the reliability of the comms initially. But I think I do get that, you know, that any one of these could take the actions and stuff, but there's still a real item that you might want to take action on, which is still in one location.
That's the physical part. You know, when you went through this reminds me of a couple things. And the first thing I want to say, though, is I think there's another dimension that could be overlaid into this that has to do with the level of centralization or decentralization of the control part of it. When you talk specifically about control systems, and the examples of that historically would be, you know, many of us on the screen are old enough to remember where computing meant mainframes, right? And there were only mainframe computers. It was very centralized. Then it went to mini mainframes, and then eventually down to desktop PCs that were all independent and non-connected and just standalone. And then the pendulum started swinging back when we networked those PCs together. And then somebody realized, oh, well, I can put a great big computer in the cloud. So this pendulum swing back towards centralized control kind of came back, right? And the same thing has happened in our industry with the advent of protocols and networks and so forth. It all went decentralized. And then when you take IPOS as a concept, you're moving that whole thing from a bigger centralized piece of equipment or hardware or whatever you want to call it into smaller and smaller components. And we're still doing that, right? We went to BAS controllers, centralized controllers, and then smart controllers, and then smart sensors that can communicate, so the moving around of the IPOS functions and the decoupling, I would add, of those functions is really what's driving this sort of hybrid. And that's really what I would call it. I don't think that this is a cloud computing scenario or an on-prem computing scenario. This is always a hybrid of those two. And where the processing occurs is a big element of this, and where this data storage comes from is the second element that's looms large in this whole architecture picture. But to me, it's always been that picture of decentralized and distributed control or centralized control and how that follows, right?
I think that, we don't want to overlook the fact that some control processes are hierarchical in nature. So it is a natural situation sometimes to want to centralize that data somewhere or centralize control. So that structure can't be ignored as an overlay. The thing that I worry about the most is that if you look at the state of cloud computing today, we basically have proprietary spheres controlled by very large IT companies. And what ends up happening is that you don't necessarily get economics or problems optimized for what we need to have in space. So if you look at Amazon Web Services or Azure, they're largely optimized for hierarchical control or use in IT systems. Then I would say that oftentimes what we need to do is the opposite of IT systems. We've talked about this many times on this show before, that a typical IT application involves thousands or tens of thousands of users trying to use a website, whereas we have 4 users trying to use a website and tens of thousands of devices that we're talking to. So it's really almost an inverse problem. And one of the physical problems I see is a business problem, that the business models that are purveyed by the large IT companies aren't very interesting. Actually, the technology is quite expensive for us to use.
But this is something that in the model of multi-cloud has to break that. I think this is not just our industry is not the only one that's talking about doing that, to bridging the private clouds and to bridge the private cloud and the private cloud. And so I think that's a natural evolution, and it's part of the swing back and forth that Tracy was talking about. Rao, good to see you, Rao. You're muted, by the way. Made some interesting comments online. I think.
Thanks, Anto. Good afternoon to all of you. I've been in this building industry from Singapore and 2 years here. I think I know Ken, I know Jim, I know Anto, and I know Anu. I was with CNA in Singapore and UTech Cybernetics in the US, and again back to CNA. We have been in the system integration business for the buildings, and we have been very successful in Asia about integrating the multiple systems in one platform. Like I mentioned in this one, I think this multi-clouding system is going to be very interesting. The reason is we used to struggle technological challenges to integrate multiple applications and processing power to get all the required solutions and information to the building owners and users. Like Jim says, yes, definitely, it cannot be decentralized, centralized. The control system has its own hierarchy to be maintained, some processing power, some intelligence, some storage should be there locally. but at the same time to utilize the new technologies, cloud technologies that helps owners and building users tremendously to analyze and apply all the analytics to the buildings and manage the buildings much better way. That is my opinion. Anyway, I'm coming back to this field again after 4 or 5 years because I had to take a back seat because of some family issues. I'm just getting back. And it's very interesting to join the Monday Live. Thanks, Anto told me that. I did watch last a few things, and I really get encouraged myself to get back to my older technology and building applications. Thank you. Thank you, Anto.
Thank you.
Great, Ralph. So, any other thoughts on what we think the cloud is? And maybe that's the question. What is the cloud, and what is the cloud not, as it were, from this group?
Before we go there, I just want to address I think it was your point or Jim's point about the fact that we're running buildings in real time and the fear over the dependency of the communication link to the cloud. So we're going over the internet. Internet it loses reliability for various reasons. Okay, so what it makes me think is if the application that's in the cloud is non-critical, asset tracking, for example, or CMMS, it's not critical to the actual operation of the building, then I don't see any particular issue. If you're going to put an application in there that's trying to operate the building in a real-time sense, if we're going to try to do that, then the cloud to premise connection or architecture, in my mind, needs to be redundant. It has to, so because you can detect if you lose communications, and when you lost communications, you need to have a very robust fail-safe operation that can continue on until the connection is restored. And I'm not aware, maybe you guys are, of a company or companies who are actively trying to solve that problem, and they're architecting their solution to address that risk scenario.
Yeah, not at a low level like you're talking about, I don't think, Steve. I wanted to add just a little statistic here. So we have tens of thousands of control devices under management, and all feeding up to a cloud platform, highly disjointed and distributed. Everything that we do is more in line with a distributed control mentality, in that, like, even individual thermostats, sorry about that, even individual thermostats and so forth are smart, distributed controllers. But at any point in time, I will add that somewhere between 10 to 20% of those assets are disconnected from the cloud. Right. So when you're architecting these systems, you have to take in that fact that it's never all that reliable, and you have to design systems that are decoupled and asynchronous to what's going on in the cloud, and understand, that that's going to be just the reality of the world. And then we've built a series of strategies around how do you then resynchronize all of that, and how do you get and move closer and closer to what you're referring to as sort of real-time control of a building. But underneath that, instead of doing it as a redundant sort of connection, we find the right balance on the timing between real-time control versus on-prem true control, right? So it's kind of that hybrid situation again.
Isn't that kind of saying, though, that the edge devices are all part of the same thing, and we just have a whole flat architecture? So when you look at a thing, everything's just, it's not the cloud, it's not the edge, it's not the device, it's one flat architecture, and those edge devices are just all part of the same thing that's on the same, they're part of, Anto's original drawing. They're just another another element that's part of the whole solution.
That's a great way to think of it. If you think of the cloud as being your hard drive, just connected by a different kind of a network, for instance, from the storage side of it, you know, that's kind of in line with what you're talking about, Roger.
The temptation for us is to think about designing an architecture where everything's all connected all of the time and everything's all deterministic.
Mm.
And I think we have to move away from that, right?
Yes.
And how you actually deal with it is going to depend on the circumstances. In some cases, you can just move the processing from cloud to local. In some cases, you can do some other things. In some cases, you can have a backup path. In some cases, you don't do it. You just don't do something, right? So those are all strategies. What Tracy was talking about is a specific strategy or set of strategies that's good for him. But you sort of work with this sort of network that is flat, logically flat, right? But not necessarily deterministically always connected.
Yeah.
Right.
The data can see anywhere, consider the edge or in the cloud or in any of those elements you said earlier, because do we need to transfer the information, all of the information, all the way around to everybody? No. You know, you just pull on it when you need it.
Yeah, and it's not hard in our situation to really do exactly what Anto was just referring to, where you address the specific needs of a specific application by architecting the right control solution for that particular thing. So lights is my favorite example.
Yeah.
Right? If you have a situation where your lights going on and off depend entirely 100% on an internet connection, you are going to be sorely disappointed at some point in time. I guarantee it, because we see it all the time, right? So you have to have a backup strategy or a parallel strategy, not necessarily redundant, maybe in the way that Steve was talking about, but a parallel strategy that allows for immediate local control, right? A schedule that is saved locally on a device and not just up in the cloud, for instance.
So let me ask you this, because particularly since you deal on the QSR marketplace, when I was doing my IT gig for 5 years, where we had critical offices that we did our remote computing for, one of the strategies to deal with reliability was to have the firewall automatically fail over to a second source. Okay, so you would have an MPLS circuit on a wide area network be the primary, which gave you, and then you had your second was they would buy an internet line, and now you had two paths. So if your MPLS went down, you failed to internet, or you could get two different internets from two different providers. In the case of one of your franchise restaurants, would they make that kind of investment?
Yes, yeah, and I'll tell you where they do it is at the most critical application, which is point of sale, the
Point of sale, right?
cash registers, right? So their primary infrastructure is generally a wired connection on Ethernet, but they have an immediate failover to a cell-based system, almost always.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. Yeah, at all. Yeah.
And then some of the bigger brands have extended that to overall connectivity of the restaurant. So I don't want to name brands by name, but in some of the big guys, they have negotiated deals or agreements with cellular providers as a backup to the primary wired infrastructure, right? With failover architectures where everything in the store switches over, not just the POS.
Not just the POS.
Right.
Okay.
So
That's
it's
good.
coming. It's coming.
That's encouraging. That really is encouraging, Tracy, because that'll solve a lot of it right there.
Yeah, and you know, we do that with our gateways now, right? Any of our new gateways that we're deploying, primary would be an Ethernet wired or Wi-Fi with a cellular failover.
Yeah.
You know, for customers in situations who are willing to pay for that. Not everybody thinks of this as such a critical thing that they need it, of course,
Right,
but
of course.
yeah, that's a pretty common.
Going back to Tracy's comment that at any one time, as much as 10% is not working, right?
More than,
More
Yeah.
than,
yeah,
It's
10 to
sort of-
20. Yeah.
Well, I read an article recently about online shopping, right? Where you'd think that part of the online shopping experience is if you want to buy something, it will check this if it actually has stock or not, right? They decided some years ago that you don't need to do that. You just take the order, right? And the worst case is if you don't have it, it's going to be late, or you can get another vendor to ship it, but just take the order, right? Even though that you know you don't have it, right? So that's a sort of a purposeful fail, right? That can be accommodated some other way. I'm not suggesting that you don't turn the light on when you want the light, because that's obviously critical, but there are certain circumstances where it doesn't really matter whether you switch the fan on now or in 10 minutes from now. You know, nobody's going to know very much, see very much difference. So that's
It
just
does with the light switch or the door opening, right?
Yeah, and
Right.
I always choose lights because it's so immediately visible.
light is,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
lights,
if
physical
you,
security.
yeah, it is. And, you know, it is considered a critical application as much as POS is in the case of a restaurant, right? Whereas the temperature, to your point, Anto, not so much,
Yeah.
right? If it takes 5 minutes for the thermostat to kick on,
Doesn't matter.
nobody even notices that compared to the lights that don't come on, right?
How about refrigeration freezers?
Same thing, that there is a buffer built in there just due to the insulative qualities of, you know, walk-ins and reach-ins and so forth. Kind of like, think about when the power goes out in your house,
You know,
right? One of the things that somebody inevitably says, don't open the refrigerator unless you absolutely have to, because we don't know when the electricity is coming back on. So the same kind of an effect in a restaurant. So
But
there
does
is
a
some
rest-
thermal.
Does a restaurant have to report to someone that the freezer went down for an hour and a half or some period of time? Because part of that is tracking the food the minute you pull it up from the ground, let's just say it's vegetables, and follow it all the way till it's actually used, cooked and served to a customer.
Now, the HACCP requirements right now are far lacking to where we as technology people know that they could be. It's primarily based on physical human measurements of temperature. So there's no overarching monitoring or guidance associated with that kind of a thing. It would be more critical that a restaurant owner would never want their inventory to end up in that situation, right? Where it's thawed out for that amount of time. So and there is HACCP requirements that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. There's a temperature above a certain, there's a dead zone above a certain temperature for a certain amount of time, then they have to dispose of the food. They don't have to report it or anything. So the typical strategy would be temperature monitoring in one of those units with alarming that would alarm well in advance enough that would give a restaurant owner the chance to take that inventory out and, you know, redistribute it in other units or other locations or whatever they need to do.
Okay, so we're coming up to the top of the hour, and maybe Jim, can I pick on you to do a little sort of wrap up of what's been discussed here?
Sure. So I think Anto did a really nice presentation that he gave us, explaining the cloud, putting it into a nice context. I think that there's an interesting discussion on where the cloud is going to be versus where it is now. And both from a business standpoint and from a technical standpoint. And I think it's going to take the next several years for us to get through that as an industry, as well as the evolution that's going to take place in the IT community as well. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, and we have the rest of April to discuss this, so looking forward to digging in on some of the aspects that we brought up in the next few weeks. So thank you, Ralph, for joining us. Thanks everybody else, and thanks to the panelists. And we'll get a video up by tomorrow. And I mean, otherwise, have a great week, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to everyone for bringing me in. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.